Shalom, WJC family. It is time for our weekly Torah Talk, and this week we are starting all over again, reading the Parsha of Bereshit, the Torah portion of Genesis, the very beginning of the Torah. I was thinking about some of the midrash, some of the rabbinic stories about creation. In many ways, we might say that the creation story itself is a midrash. There are, of course, those who take the story literally. I am not a biblical literist in this way. I read the creation story as an ode to God, who brings order out of chaos. And that order is sort of represented in this poem that is the creation story. But in Tractate Psachim, there's a very important rabbinic discussion about creation, about exactly what was created and how and why. And I want to highlight that today from the point of view of what does creation have to do with us? What does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with you? Particularly if we don't read this creation story as the literal facts of creation, then why do we need to know about it at all? So the midrash is going to come in two pieces. The first piece says seven phenomena. Shiva devarim nivru kodem shenivra haolam. There were seven ideas, seven phenomena, seven things that were created before the world was created. They are Torah, Utshuva, Vegan Eden, Vegehinom, Vekisei HaKavod, Uveit HaMikdash, Ushmo Shel Mashiach. They are Torah, which is often considered like the blueprint for creation, and tshuva, repentance, the Garden of Eden, and Gehenna. Gehenna, sort of a Jewish idea of purgatory or something to that effect. Some afterlife that's the opposite of Gan Eden. Not exactly like heaven and hell as we think of it in a Christian paradigm, but something about an afterlife for those who deserve reward and those who deserve punishment. And the throne of glory, right? The seat of God in the world. And the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, where that throne of glory would be centered, the Ark of the Covenant would go, and the name of the Messiah, the name of Mashiach. So what does it mean that these things were created even before the world? These are built into the fabric of the world, and I think it's such a beautiful idea, particularly Torah and Tshuva. And if we read Gan Eden and Gehenna as sort of the ideas of good and evil, that these things are woven into the fabric of the world means that we are not expected to be perfect, right? That Torah needs to come, wisdom to give us guidance in how to live, and tshuva, to repentance, right? Tshuva, this idea that we may err from the path that God's laid for us, but the path is laid for us, and that there'll always be a way to get back to it. Love those ideas, and the idea of good and evil, that there is a universal concept of good and evil. We as people can't always put our finger on it exactly, but it exists. I find those ideas very comforting. The second part of the midrash that I want to share, I think is equally beautiful and equally relevant to us. Right? It says that Asara devarim nivru be'erev Shabbat ben hashmashot. So there were 10 items that God created on the sixth day, just before Shabbat was going to start, right? These are the last 10 things that God created before the seventh day upon which God rested, the Shabbat day, the Sabbath day. Eluhain, and these are them. Be'er, the well, presumably referring to a mystical well that followed Miriam in the desert, from which the Israelites were able to drink as they wandered. V'haman, that which they ate in the desert, manna. V'keshet, and the rainbow. This rainbow, of course, referring to the covenantal rainbow that's made in the time of Noah. Katav machtev, which is a little unclear exactly what these things are. Maybe it's writing and writing implements. Maybe it's the form of the letters and the engravings of the letters. A little hard to say, but writing. V'haluchot, and the shnei luchot habrit, the stones upon which the Ten Commandments were written. V'kivro shel Moshe, Moshe's resting place on Har Nebo. Only God knows where that is. U'me'ara she'amad bo Moshe ve'Eliyahu, and the cave upon Mount Sinai, where Moses and Elijah each stood different times, but the same cave. Ptichat pi ha'aton, the opening of the mouth of Bilam's famous talking donkey, a talking donkey in the Torah well before the writers of Shrek came up with it. And he is, I think, also, by the way, a comic character, because how could a talking donkey not be? Up'tichat pi ha'aretz, and the mouth that opens up in the land, livloa et harishaim, to swallow the evil ones, here referring to the mouth where the world opened to swallow the rebels in the time of Korach. Now, again, I think it's fascinating which things are picked here to be the last things God said, almost the cherries on top of creation, and how it shows forethought, how it shows that God planned ahead. And by the way, the texts say, it's not that God created the donkey that Bilam would ride on in the story in the Torah, and that donkey lived from the sixth day of creation until the time of the Exodus, but that God had laid the plans for the Exodus. The idea of the Exodus already existed in the mind of God. Now we say that God planned these 10 things, and it would seem to imply that everything else was not planned in advance. But I think, in fact, the opposite is true. What this midrash tells us when it says these 10 things that this midrash wants to highlight for whatever reasons of its own were created on the idea of them, at least, in the mind of God as the sun set on the sixth day of creation. What it is really telling us is not that only these 10 things arose in the mind of God at that time. It's telling us that everything arose in the mind of God at that time. Because as philosophers like Rambam and others, Maimonides, have said, God lives outside of time. When we say that God is in all times, what we really mean is God is outside of time, that time is a human phenomenon or a created phenomenon, and God is before creation. God is outside of time, in all of time, beyond time. And therefore, when God creates the world, God creates all times, all at once, continuing creation and animating creation in every moment, as the mystics say. And what that means is God created these 10 things. The fact that God had these 10 things in God's mind, in the whatever that means, as Christian, what it's telling us is that God had all of this in mind. God had you in mind as the sun was setting on the sixth day of creation. God had me in mind as the sun was setting on the sixth day of creation. And what did God have in mind about us? I don't know exactly. But we have a purpose, that our neshama, our divine self, has a purpose in the mind of God. And I truly believe that when we are on that derech, remember it said tshuva was created even before the world, that when we are walking on our path, we can feel it deep within us. There is a resonance, there is a joy of being on the path that God intends for us. And when we're not, it hurts, and that there is a real pain and a need to do tshuva, to come back to that path. That God, before God created the world, God made that path of return for us, that we celebrated over the last several weeks as we observed the high holidays. And so if we are not feeling like we are on that path, and look, I'm not saying that everything is preordained. I'm not saying that God had in mind exactly what your life would be like. I'm not saying that there's no free choice. Of course, none of that is what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that free choice or not, whether or not we want to follow that path, that we have a purpose as part of this creation. Exactly what the purpose is, exactly what the puzzle means, that is, longer than our 11-minute video can bear. But it's worth exploring and it's worth wondering. But one thing to know is that if there is a creator, if this poem is not literally true, but is figuratively true, that there is a force in the universe, God, that works to bring order out of chaos, to go against what we know is true in the universe, go against the laws of entropy, that everything, left on its own falls apart, that something put things together with a purpose, that you and I are part of that purpose. We have a reason for being here. And if we're not feeling that, then maybe we're barking up the wrong tree, so to speak, like our ancestors, Adam and Eve. That's a real thing, barking up the wrong tree, eating the wrong fruit, so to speak. And so my blessing for us as we begin a new rolling of the Torah, a new reading of the Torah, as we tell the story of creation again, is that we should all feel our purpose, feel our neshamas resonate with the vibrations of fulfillment of the reason why we were created. You are not an accident, and I am not an accident. And while we might not be clever enough or wise enough to understand the mind of God, we can understand how we are part of the mind of God. And in that, take real comfort and look for that purpose and hopefully fulfill that purpose. Wish you a Shabbat Shalom and a purposeful week ahead.